Today is from my book Charcoal. Charcoal is the story of a young African-American art student who is convinced by her professor to use charcoals made with the remains of an extremely wicked, sadistic, and cruel Victorian painter. In doing so, she is forced into a terrible bargain and learns about the sad, blood-soaked legacy of the arts.
No, man, seeing is important.
There were those who said the man who cremated Thomas Kemp smothered his own infant son in his crib. They say that he had heard a voice that told him that the earth was the devil's domain, and that this base-born boy would see hardship, poverty, and abuse above all else. The voice would go on to tell him that a person can do nothing, so terrible, can do nothing so kind as to liberate their offspring from an indignant earth and prevent them from knowing what it is to live in the cruel, debased realm of matter under the bitter gaze of the nemesis of God. He would comply, and beneath a pillow, the child would find freedom from myriad ills of which life was composed. They say when this man's wife came home, she looked on his works, mouth agape, and asked him why he had done that. Which he'd just done, and received from him a long and thorough refutation of the virtues of life on earth. He had never read philosophy. He had never attended lectures on the subject. He had certainly never unloaded such a polysyllabic assault on the kindness of the Almighty. But he took right to it. And in her present vulnerable state, she found truth in his words and begged for him to take her life. He complied, choking her to death. Now alone and faced with the realities of his actions, there was only one thing to do. Impatient, unable to take another moment of life so cruel and unfair and devoid of potential, he picked up a knife and slit his own throat. This story said it only took contact with Kemp's remains to drive him mad and to suicidal and homicidal fervor. The story said his wickedness had seeped into his body and passed on to the bones, spreading a crude Manichaeanism that could only lead to murder. The story was only a myth. From a time where such things were harder to verify, it had been told at parties by Crowley, Blavatsky, and years later, Orson Welles, Jimmy Page, and Grant Morrison. Popular though it was, it had been untrue, and the sanitization of a colder and harsher truth about the ashes of Thomas Kemp the libertine. The cruelty and perversity of Thomas Kemp was not kept in his bones. It was not so clear as this. If we keep our hands off Polanski's clapboard and OJ's gloves, ghost stories tell us that we shall remain untainted by their poisons. The cruelty of Thomas Kemp was in his legend, in the words of those who said libertine instead of monster, iconoclast instead of brute, philosopher instead of madman. The cruelty of Thomas Kemp was in the charcoal because the ground he'd rested in had been salted down and henceforth could be tended but with blood. And with the ecstasy of circles, Shannon feverishly scribbled and connected to the shameless past. She began to feel that connection, the hand that goads, the eyes that judge, the face beneath. There on that canvas, hidden in those dark spirals, she had called the face beneath. Their words we speak, they're only larval howls, destined for short life as caterwaul before dying on the ears of a listener assailed. They begin as impulses under words, growing into breath, and come out as attempts to communicate. They hounded, plagued, and chased her. They led her back to the professor's office and asking if she could try the charcoals out again for a bit. She smiled big, explained the eyes he'd stared into. She smiled big, exploited the eyes he stared into, flirted though he had filled her with contempt and revulsion, and on those vague promises that made her feel filthy, she brought the charcoals home for a week. At first they felt wrong in her hands. They were rough, awkward, and they left smudges on her fingers. They were imprecise compared to pencils and brushes, forcing her to stroke wider strokes. When the oils she was used to came in a myriad of colors, the charcoals were irrevocably black. Insistent though they were, the dancing figures she'd once drawn evoked a multitude of feelings and circumstances and brought her to places that were more than endless night. She did not like the thick inky smudge of it, which turned the act of creation into a mess. In the home of an awkward single mom, one learns not to be a pest or a noise. And the smudging made the process all these things. These were not the charcoals, but those simple charcoals were a hassle and fright. Shannon had loved simple forms. She had not been contested with anything as simple as the dancing figures that had failed her. But the transformation of geometry into narrative was intriguing. When angles and lines could have lives and feelings and essence. Then she could indulge a combination of secrecy and revelation that made her feel comfortable. Having been discouraged from making noise, she did not like things to be concrete and resolute. She did not want to reveal herself, and yet she longed to be known, to be really known, to be truly known. One must be read. One must be scrutinized. So far beyond Dessa, Janelle, Portishead, Mondrian, and all of the things on her that adorned her walls. And known for who she was, with fervor, curiosity, and deep inquiry. The darkness became her darkness, and she could not abide her darkness. She had been told to smile. She has been told that that there are things we just don't talk about, and people we don't say them to, and that we were to keep our secrets close and curtsy and carry on calmly. The smudges on her fingers, the caw of crows begging to be born. They called not for carrion, and though there were enough dead and gone, they could be granted it. They smelled the bodies left behind and thirsted for the worms that crawled in them. She did not want to give that up. Let it come to the fore and consume her mind, her heart, and her hands. And then after that, her canvas. It was not right. But the crows, they were insistent. And the dark was thick and undulating. And the smudges were upon her fingers, and the charcoals in her hand. And they meant something that they wouldn't have meant before. Her father was bleeding on the pavement. His eyes were wide, his mouth open, and he needed the ambulance. Her father was wearing the armor that had not held back the bullet, and he was trying to breathe and live to see them again. The crows weren't there. There was more than that they hungered for, and she knew it. And even though she wanted to hold them back from feeding them, even though they were just birds and shapes upon a canvas, shapes she should not fear as they came from her, she was being ridiculous. She walked away from the canvas, went to the bathroom, washed her hands, and let the dark circle the drain. It was gone from her fingers, gone from her mind. Had they left, or were they merely sated? Sorry about that. This is in italic, that chapter is italics. So I'm reading italics in this light.